All right, we are somewhere. You know, the Gospels move fairly quickly to the call of the 12, which is kind of interesting because it really kind of gives you an idea of how little information we really have about Jesus. I mean, it seems like there's a lot sometimes when we study it, but truth is, we don't have a lot. You know, we have a very short amount before he calls the 12, and there's only a year and a half between calling the 12 and the cross. So, you know, really, we don't have a tremendous amount of information chronologically about Christ here. And it kind of brings that into a little bit of clarity when you see the break about the calling of the 12. Jesus had a lot that followed him, a lot of people, multitudes by this time. We've seen his popularity increasing, the people that were rushing to him, the people that were following him. And they called them disciples. Many of them looked at Jesus as a rabbi or a teacher, a master teacher. Um, and they were revered in that society. People sat at their feet to heal. But Jesus was so much more than that, wasn't he? He was performing miracles. He was performing signs. He was performing wonders. People were following him. They were coming to him. They were hanging upon his words. They were there to trick him or there to listen to him or there maybe to learn from him. And yet it seemed like they didn't have the understanding that maybe they should have had from the words that he spoke. And as those people were following him for these periods of time, which has always been kind of amazing to me, I guess I don't see things through the eyes of the first century. You know, I see things through our eyes. And, you know, in our time, in our eyes, how hard would it be for most people just to drop everything and follow somebody around the hillsides of the country for, you know, basically this is a year and a half now, right? Year and a half that this has been going on. And yet these are with him. Peter and Andrew, James, John, they're with him. They're following him. We're going to talk a little bit about this morning about Peter in our sermon, but they're following him and they're attached to him. And at this time, he goes up on the mountain. I think it's Peter goes up on the mountain to pray to choose the 12. It's not something that he did hastily. He went up on the mountain. Jesus says in John, he says, "Didn't I choose the 12, and yet one of you is a devil?" Right? Did he choose Judas purposefully? Yeah, probably. There was decisions to be made, right? Somebody had to betray him. Somebody had to be he had to fill in these gaps, these spaces with these men that were basically uneducated. He appointed the 12 that they'd be with him, and he could send them out to preach and to have authority to cast out demons. Mark says, that's later on, right? You got to remember, Gospels are always written in hindsight. So, you know, oftentimes we look at Gospels almost like a journal or a diary or something that was written as it went on day by day. But Gospels were written in hindsight. So when Mark's looking at them and the casting out demons, this is a real later thing. This maybe is not even something that, you know, at this point Jesus was necessarily sharing with them that they would even have this power. But, of course, he's writing in hindsight. But the thrust of it here, he spent the night in prayer, and he calls the 12. And, of course, these lists vary slightly. Levi, Matthew, we know to be the same guy. They always start with the inner circle. Peter, Andrew, James, John are always the start of these lists. And it always ends with Judas, always with a moniker, right? The one who betrayed him. Of course, like I said, these aren't diaries. These were written after 60 AD, in the 60s AD, after Christ, 35 years after Jesus was crucified, the Gospels were written. So they knew Judas. They knew, of course, the story. And so when they wrote these Gospels and made the list, Judas was at the end. But, you know, that's how we perceive it. That's how and possibly how they want us to perceive it. But, you know, Judas was just one of the 12 at this point. You know, they didn't know he was going to be the one to betray him. They didn't have that idea whatsoever. He was just one of the ones Jesus chose. And obviously they had a good relationship with him for a long period of time. You know, a lot of them we don't know much about, right? There's several different types of people in here. There's a zealot. You know, that's kind of odd, isn't it? The zealots are the ones who wanted to overthrow Rome. Eventually would cause the overthrow of Rome in 71 AD. That was brought on by the zealots, those who wanted to militarily overthrow Rome. Kind of interesting, one of Jesus' disciples, apostles, Jesus, who taught love and and taught this idea that we can get along in the Roman world, and yet he chooses one of his apostles, a zealot. I think that's kind of interesting, isn't it? A tax collector, right? Matthew was a tax collector. Tax collectors were hated, despised, looked down upon, yet Jesus chose Matthew, Levi, out of the tax collector's booth, and Matthew gives us the gospel, Matthew's gospel, which is really aimed towards the Jews. Some of them we know less about. Bartholomew, we know very little about him. Philip, Matthew, Thomas. We just don't know a lot about a lot of these people. James, the son of Alphaeus. James the Less, we call him. So we don't know a lot about some of these. James the Great, is at the beginning. We call him James the Less. Jesus' brother James, we call him James the Just. So we don't know a lot about a lot of these guys. Bartholomew, according to tradition, was skinned alive. Was actually skinned alive. I always thought that was very gruesome. But they all died terrible deaths, didn't they? Except John. John, who died at a late age in Ephesus. Got to go to the tomb of John. Whether or not he's really there or not, I don't know, but it did say tomb of John. So, I'm going with that. So anyway, but got to go there on this trip. Saw that, St. John's Cathedral, which, of course, was built a long time after John. And so that's interesting. He died in Ephesus, went to the house of the Virgin Mary in Ephesus, which, according to tradition, John built around the backside of Ephesus so that she wouldn't be persecuted. Whether or not that's really her house or not, I don't have a clue, but they say it is. So, I don't know. We'll go with that, right? So, but the neat thing was actually going into Ephesus and standing in the theater and knowing, yeah, this really is the theater. The rest of it's kind of like, yeah, possibly, but when you go there, it's like, yeah, this is really it. So that was really neat. Mars Hill was neat, knowing that really was Mars Hill. So much stuff is maybe, sort of, I don't know. But it's all neat. So anyway, John dies late in Ephesus, interestingly. But a lot of them we don't know a lot about. Some we know quite a bit about, but the majority we don't. We're very little, actually, about the lives. Traditionally, we know where most of them wound up. We know how most of them died, but we don't know a tremendous amount about what happened to them after Jesus was crucified and raised. We don't know their story. We know the story of Peter pretty well. We know the story of Paul. And beyond that, it gets a little cloudy, doesn't it? James, of course, was crucified early in the book of Acts, so we kind of know his story. But beyond that, it gets a little more murky. John, Peter, right? John, Peter, Paul, which Paul was called late. But the rest of them, it's not as clear of a story, is it? I don't know a lot. But Jesus chose them, and then he went up on this mountain and he preached what we consider to be the greatest sermon ever preached, Sermon on the Mount. We're going to spend some time on the Sermon on the Mount. What a hard sermon. These ideals that Jesus held up in front of us that almost to extent seem unattainable, don't they? Seem like you can't live the Sermon on the Mount. But I don't think Jesus would have given us things we couldn't do. Sometimes people look at the Sermon on the Mount and say this is the ideal, and there's no way we can ever reach this ideal. So why do we can't strive for it? But I don't really hold to that thought process necessarily. Jesus was teaching to those who were, a lot of them were poor. A lot of them were the ones who were the downtrodden of society. The religious world looked down upon them at that time. And yet he also had religious leaders in the crowd, didn't he? Those who were trying to trick him, those who were trying to persecute him, to trick him, to capture him in falsehood. Jesus spoke boldly, didn't he? Everybody there wasn't, I'm sure, happy with the things that Jesus said. Some of them probably were pretty upset about a lot of what he said, to be honest about it. Some people say it wasn't just one sermon. It was multiple sermons, and it all got put together in one place for us. I don't know if that's true or false. Nobody does. Some people think it's a kind of a conglomeration of several different sermons that Jesus preached and not just one discourse. If it was one discourse, what a sermon, right? Off the cuff, to be able to say what Jesus said. What a sermon, to be able to do that. and to be able to flow through like he did on the subjects that he touched upon, which were dear to a lot of them. But he starts with the Beatitudes, the blessings. We call them Beatitudes. And I think the blessings are they're really interesting for me to look at. Of course, they were there because of what he could do. The disciples came to him. He opened his mouth. Matthew says, Luke, who gives us some really great insight into the Sermon on the Mount, because Luke kind of has a version of that too. So Matthew and Luke are both kind of involved in that discourse, although it's in Luke 6. Jesus came down, stood in a level place, a large crowd, great throng of people, Judea, Jerusalem, the coastal region of Tyre and Sidon, very mixed audience who had come to hear him be healed of their diseases, filled with unclean spirits and being cured, and all the people were trying to touch him, for power was coming from him and healing them all. This idea of physical contact, touching Jesus, the power coming out of him, you can imagine the people that were pressing upon him. The woman with the issue of blood obviously knew of this. That's why she was so trying to touch just the hem of his garment. See that in Scripture, don't we? Power of touch. The apostles, even in Acts, they would get handkerchiefs and carry them to those that were sick, handkerchiefs that have been touched or held upon. And in some ways, this is where we get the idea of relics, or things that have some sort of power because they're ancient or old or touched by someone that was holy. Kind of comes from these ideas. But they were pressing upon him, trying to touch him, trying to reach him, and Jesus begins this sermon, turning his gaze towards his disciples. He begins the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. The Anawim, those left behind, Hebrew, where it comes from the word Anawim in the Hebrew. Those left behind, those nobody wants is what that means. Not necessarily those who are troubled in spirit or burdened in spirit, but he really means those who are outcasts, those who are left behind, those who aren't on the front. Those, the last ones to be picked, the ones that are left is what that comes from in the Hebrew. The ones that were left during Babylonian captivity when the Babylonians carried off all the people who had value, and everybody else that was left there, the ones had no value, essentially, in the eyes of the Babylonians. The Anawim, poor in spirit, those left, is what that means. Every one of these comes with a blessing. Every one of them is about where you are now, not where you will be. It took me a long time to realize that in my life. It's not something we strive to be to get blessed. We don't strive to be poor in spirit to get blessed. We don't strive to mourn to be blessed. It's not something we strive to do. Jesus wasn't saying that. Jesus was saying that even in your distress, even in your trouble, even in your discomfort, there's a blessing for you if you're faithful to God. So you don't always fit the category, but at some point in your life, you probably will fit some of the categories, what I'm trying to say. At some point in your life, you're going to be one of these people. You're going to be the people that Jesus is talking to right here. And he's giving you reassurance that even in your distress, even in your trouble, that you're blessed. So it's a real amazing thing because he's talking to people, a lot of the people in this crowd who are the Anawim, the ones that were left behind, the ones that aren't considered important, the uneducated, the sick, the lame, the ones with problems, diseases, demons, those who are unclean, those who the religious world looks down upon, or probably society looks down upon, and yet Jesus looks at them and he says, but you're blessed by God. I don't know if they felt that blessed by God, but Jesus was saying, you're blessed by God. You don't understand that God blesses you where you're at, not in your perfection, which is what the religious world of Jesus' time looked at. Those who were perfect, those in their perfection, the scribes, the Pharisees, the rich, the wealthy, the healthy, those people were who God had blessed. That was the religious view of the day. That was the blessing of God. They were blessed. So if you weren't in that group, you weren't blessed. And Jesus stands up and says, yes, you are. Yes, you are. God recognizes, God knows you. God sees you, even though the world doesn't see you that way. God does, and there's a blessing for you eternally, if not in this world, eternally, because of the position that you have in this world. Does that make any sense? And that's really a good idea. It's a great thought, isn't it? It's this idea that there's some sort of justice. There's some sort of a cosmic justice in the world, and that God authors that, and that even though we don't always receive the blessing in this life that maybe others do, and maybe we have grief in our lives that others don't have, Jesus was giving this concept that was very foreign to the Jews, that even in that, there's this equilibrium. There's this blessing of God that even if we're suffering in this life, there's reward in the next, that blessings exist regardless of where we are, and that God's going to equalize things. Jesus speaks of this, doesn't he? The first will be last, the last will be first. Jesus talks about that idea. Even with the rich man and Lazarus, what was the moral, the idea, the outcome of the story was, in this life you had your pleasure, you had your riches, you had your reward, right? And yet poor Lazarus, he had none of that. He was sick, he was diseased, he was poor, he was at your gate, he didn't have anything to eat. And yet now, who gets the reward? Didn't Jesus say, right? Who was Jesus talking to? He's talking to those people who were laying at the gate sick and diseased and suffering. And he says, guess what? Eternally, this is going to equal out. And I think there's hope for us in that. There's blessings for us in that. And that's what God was trying to give us in these blessings. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for yours is the kingdom of God. The kingdom of heaven. Interestingly, see, Matthew doesn't use kingdom of God very much. Kingdom of heaven. I don't know. There's a lot of debate about that. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. You see, these blessings are not about, we don't strive to get to this place to be blessed, but Jesus is saying if you're in this place, there's a blessing for you. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. That doesn't make sense to the world. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Jesus will talk about that, right? You'll be judged with the same judgment you judge. With the same mercy you have towards others, you'll have mercy. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Jesus is picking all these different groups of people that were stressed, grieved, and saying, guess what? There's blessings for you can't see. And there's blessings eternally for you that you can't understand. It's a promise of God that even when we feel like we're on the outside looking in, God still sees us and knows us, and God will bless us if we're faithful, regardless of the situation that we're in. Blessed are when people hurt, when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. Very close reading to Luke. For in the same way, their fathers they persecuted the prophets who were before you. But you are the salt of the earth. And he goes into this idea. I think it's interesting. Of course, if you look at Luke, woe to your well-fed now, for you shall be hungry. Luke kind of shifts it, doesn't he? You know, Matthew kind of brings up the positives. Blessed are you, for you shall. But if you really look at Luke, Luke says, woe to you who are rich, for you receiving your comfort in full. So Luke goes to the woes, right? The blessings and the woes. Woe are you to the rich, for you've received your comfort, right? Woe to you who are well fed now, for you shall be hungry. Woe to you who are laughed now, for you shall mourn and weep. Woe to you when all men speak well of you, for their fathers used to treat the false prophets in the same way. So Luke kind of turns it around. He not only says, blessed are you if you're in one of these categories of the oppressed, but woe to you if you're one of these here that's in this other category that thinks your wealth or thinks that your health or your well-being or your status is really what makes you right in God's eyes. It doesn't. It doesn't make you right in God's eyes. So he's giving you both sides of it, the blessings and the woes in Luke. And Matthew doesn't do that. Are there any comments? So is it all inclusive? I mean, are all the rich going to be Can the rich not inherit the kingdom of God? Or the rich? We're pretty rich people, I mean, comparatively, right? So is that all inclusive? Are the ones who are fed, are all of them going to wind up being hungry? Is it all inclusive, or what? Is there a stipulation? Is there a trusting? What would we say? Were they trusting? Is it because they're trusting in their wealth, or trusting in their ability to take care of themselves? Or is it just because that in this life, if we're blessed in this life, we're cursed in the next, and if we're cursed in this life, we're blessed in the next? You think that's right? Yeah, I think so too. Joseph of Arimathea was a wealthy man. I think Jesus probably said it best with the rich young ruler, and he says, "How hard is it for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven? It's easy for the camel to go through an eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven." And the disciples said, "Well, how is it possible?" And Jesus says what? He says, "With man it's not possible. With God, what? All things are possible," right? So, yeah, I think it's a state of being, state of idea, state of mind, state of where they were. Um, then I think the hardest part about the situation that we find ourselves in often in the world, and I think those, especially so many that are so much worse off than us in the world, I think it's easy to feel cursed of God sometimes. Why me? Why does this happen to me? We're human. We look at other people. We look at what's happening in other people's lives, and we think, why, why is that not me? Or why don't I have that blessing? Or why don't, and we tend not to look at the people around us that are worse off than we are, do we? We tend to look at those that are better off than we are. And oftentimes we think, and not just better off financially, but better off in a lot of ways, right? There's all kinds of different, everybody has their story, right? Everybody has your the thing in your life, and you look at other people and you think, well, why does this happen to me? Why? And that's, I guess, the eternal question. Um, but I think Jesus, like Gary says, in this, he's giving hope to those who maybe don't understand their position or their state of life. Um, and maybe would like to think that there is, and we have reassurance that there is a balance in the face of God, and that God will take care of those who are his regardless, and especially in eternity, that God will reward and take care of those who are his children. And the world doesn't often look at things that way. We look at God's blessings as blessings here, yet we should be looking for blessings that are eternal. Um, I think we can. That's a really hard question to answer. I think we're all different in how we look at things and justice and God. But for someone who's starving, to see someone who's eating well is why me? I mean, that's just an example of a million examples, right? Um, we like to think there's some sort of great cosmic balance, don't we? I mean, isn't that what Jesus is trying to say? That somehow in the state of eternity, things will equal out, right? Rewards will be given, punishment will be meted out. God, the great righteous judge, will stand and make things the way they should be in the end. So, I mean, that's our faith. I don't look at life in the sense that, of course, you all probably know, I've said it many times, I'm not a predestinationalist. I don't look at life as being all put out by God, and I certainly don't see everything that happens as God's will in the earth. I think that's a really childish way to look at the world, by the way. Um, but I do think that God, you really got to look what Paul says in Romans. All things work together for good, those love the Lord, called according to his purpose. You have to have some faith that even in tragedy, even in distress, even in poverty, that all things eventually work together for good to those that love the Lord. And that's Paul's promise. So I think you have to look towards that. I don't think you can look at someone that's, and they did. I don't think you can look at someone that's healthy or wealthy or wiser or more blessed in some way that you are and say, well, God's really blessing them, and why is God not blessing me? I think that's really a wrong way to view the world or our state in our life, state in the world. Because there's a million variables in life. I think you just have to look that in the end, God's going to make everything the way that it should be. I mean, that's the faith of Christianity. That should be our faith. In the end, God's going to make everything the way it should be. This life is fleeting at best, right? And the pleasures of this life and the blessings of this life at best are very fleeting. And the misery and the grief of this life are very fleeting. Because this life isn't that long. In the scope of eternity, which we should look towards, that's a long time, right? And that's what we should look towards. There's always people that's worse off than you. There's always people that's better off than you. There always will be. That's life. And whatever game you play, that's life. You know. Yeah. You're right. We never know. You never know the heart of someone. You never know the state of someone. There's people who we think are very happy, should be very happy, very blessed people who wind up taking their own lives, or tragic things come out of their blessings. So we do the best we can with the state we have, the place that we are, the people that we are, the path that we have. We do the best we can as Christians, with the understanding, as Jesus would give us the hope, that in the end all things will be right. All things will be right. That's the faith of Christians. That's our faith. We should look towards eternity. But then he goes right into the idea of your influence. And I think it's interesting because he's just talked to people who don't feel very influential. He's just talked to people who are those who are mourning and those that are poor in spirit and those that are... He's just talked to all these people that don't feel very salty, right? As Buck said the other night, right? They don't feel very salty, right? These are people who feel kind of downtrodden. And yet Jesus looks at them. And I think if you look at who this is addressed to, who did he look toward? You know, the Pharisees are there. The scribes are there. The people who are the rich, the wealthy, the religious leaders, they're in the crowd. They're listening to him. They're there, right? But when you really look at the beginning of this, if you really look at how this starts, and I don't know if you notice this, but look at 20. Turning his gaze towards his disciples, he began to say. You see that? He really wasn't preaching necessarily to those there that were the rich and the wealthy, the elite, the religious leader. I think he touches upon them. I think the sermon reaches towards them. But I think the predominant, especially at the beginning of the sermon, the predominant theme here is not those that were considered the blessed religiously, but it was those who were poor. It was those who were downtrodden. It was his disciples, the ones that were following him, the ones that really wanted to know. And so he looks at these people who don't feel like they're very salty, right? And he says, you're the salt. You're the salt of the earth. You have power. You have influence. You have in your life. And you don't feel that way because you don't feel very powerful. If you're the poor in spirit, if you're the one who's grieving, if you're the ones who's searching for truth and can't find it, you don't feel very salty. You don't feel that way, but yet Jesus looks at him. He said, but you're the salt of the earth. Yeah. Well, we don't have the answer to that. I can't. They deal with it in a lot of different ways, people who don't know God, even in the world, yeah. Well, sure he does. Sure he does. And we don't know the mercy of God. We don't know. We just don't have the answer. You know, we have to take the whole world throughout history, throughout the history of the world. I don't care where you go in the world. I don't care if you go where we went and see Greek gods and Roman gods, or if you go to the Mexico and see Mayan gods, or you go to, right? Wherever you go, there's gods, isn't there? You ever notice that? Wherever you go in the world, there's gods, right? How come? Because man wrestles with the very questions we wrestle with, right? Why do good things happen? Why do bad things happen? And what do we do to change that? Well, if bad things happen, there has to be a cause. Cause and effect. It's all about cause and effect. There has to be a reason. Bad things happen, there has to be a reason. So, there has to be some, and throughout the centuries, throughout eternity, man's looked towards something bigger than them, some higher power, a God. Whatever they might call that God, they've looked towards a God to appease or to sacrifice to, or to make their life better, or to understand why if God's mad, their life is bad. It was real simple in ancient times. Cause and effect was real simple. Well, I don't care if you was a Roman or a Greek or a Mayan or whatever you were. If bad things happened, your gods were mad. You had to appease your gods. If good things happened, your gods were happy. You did good things. So they built temples and they made sacrifices and they did all these things to the gods because they wanted to make blessings. They wanted to get blessings. And they would go to these temples that we visited, these ruins of these temples, and they made these great architectural marvels, not because they wanted to live in them, but because they were trying to build them to a God. And yet, as I go through the places we've gone through, interestingly, I see the similarities in Catholicism and the great cathedrals and the monuments we built to God, and churches that have become museums, sadly enough. And we followed that same path because we failed to understand or failed to know truly who God is, and a truthful and living God that we serve, and a God that looks upon us and it equalizes things. That if once again we throw ourselves into this ancient idea of cause and effect, that everything's because all my misfortunes because God's not happy with me, and my blessings because God is happy with me, we really miss the point of God. Just trying to tell you, we really miss the point. Because that's never been the point of God, right? Ever. Yes. Right. I think, you see, back to your question, I think it was interesting. I said Mars Hill, that's where Paul goes in Athens was Mars Hill. And he sees all the statues to the gods and one to an unknown God. People who didn't know our God, right? And what did he tell them? He says, there's a time that God winked at this ignorance, right? But now he commands all men everywhere to repent. I think it's how does God deal with those who have never had a chance to know him, who've never had what we have? We don't have the answer. But Paul said there was a time that God winked at that ignorance. In other words, God, I don't know exactly how you take that or how Paul meant that, I don't exactly know. But God didn't seem to be concerned. But if we come to know God, if we have the ability, then of course That changes who we should be in relationship to God. God's a merciful God. I don't know what happens to people. I don't know what happens to people in the remotest part of the Amazon or wherever that are never going to hear about the God that we have. I don't know. I don't have that answer. But I know we're responsible for what we know. Yeah, Becky. Well, absolutely. Sure, we should be merciful. Hmm. Well, I don't think mercy necessarily, I mean, you could tie it to forgiveness in a sense, but the idea of merciful is really the idea of not meting out punishment, understanding that God's in control. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. The idea of letting God have vengeance upon those things in our lives and not taking it upon ourselves to have vengeance on those things. The idea of mercy is not giving someone the just punishment that they deserve. God says we'll be judged by the same mercy or the same judgment we judge. So if we have mercy on someone else, then God will have mercy on us. If you judge someone harshly, especially hypocritically, for something that you do yourself, it's really, in a way, the biblical thought. We're out of time. But if you judge someone especially harshly for something that you do, you've pronounced your own judgment. When David sinned with Bathsheba, Nathan comes to him and pointed out the sin, and David says, that man shall die. David pronounced his own judgment. You see, David didn't have any mercy on the man. David pronounced his own judgment. That man's worthy of death. And David was worthy of death. But God said, I've forgiven you, you shall not die. God had mercy upon him. So we had to be careful, especially judging things in other people's lives that we're guilty of ourselves. Being unmerciful to people who basically are doing things that we've done. Righteous judgment, to judge unrighteously. Don't worry about the speck in your brother's eye when there's a log in your own eye. In other words, if you're doing the same thing, then how can you judge somebody else for doing that same thing? Well, obviously you can't. So, merciful, to have mercy, not to met out punishment, is really what that means there. Blessed are the merciful. In other words, we shall receive mercy, right? If we're harsh, then we should be treated harsh. If we have mercy, there's the story of the slave, way out of time, where he goes in, owes all the money, right? Begs at his feet, don't persecute me, I owe you all this money. He says, okay, I won't. You can go. Yeah, I forgive you your debt. And then the guy he forgave goes out and he hoards all the people that owe him a little bit of money and throws them in prison. And the guy brings him back and he says, now I'm not going to have any mercy on you. Because even though I forgave you all this great debt, you went out to the people who owed you and you wouldn't forgive them. And now I'm going to hold you accountable. So God really is big on us being hypocritical in our judgment and in our mercy and in our forgiveness for sure. So I hope that helps a little bit. We're way out of time. Thanks for your time.